Hi, good morning. We're back at the Mystery of History, Volume 4. We're on page 12. We're looking at the 13 colonies. We have looked at already, let's review a little. Virginia was founded first, then Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Pilgrims founded that. New Hampshire in 1622. I don't remember reading about New Hampshire with Sir Fernando Gorges and Captain John Mason.
I think I remember that a bit.
Then there was New York, which is settled by the Dutch. Then, oh no, wait. That's it. We stopped there. Okay, so we're going to the 5th colony today, and that was Maryland. Have you ever heard of Baltimore, Maryland? Well, we have, because we live not that far away from Baltimore, Maryland, and we've been there several times.
There's a train museum there, and once we went there for my birthday.
Yep. Been there several times. And, in fact, we're going to go back soon to go to the Baltimore Zoo. Let's see. It was named for George Calvert, who was the first Baron Baltimore, a Roman Catholic from England who was trying to colonize Maryland. Unfortunately, George died in 1632 before realizing his dream to make a Catholic colony in the New World. His sons were Leonard and Cecil Calvert, and they continued the mission. We know from one of Leonard's letters that his first voyage to America, excuse me, in 1633 to 1634, it occurred over Christmas, and Christmas was celebrated on board the ship. However, despite the fact that 30 or more colonists were sick with fever, and at least 12 died on that journey. I share this with you. This is Mrs. Hobart speaking. I share this with you just to remind us of the enormous dangers the early colonists faced when crossing the Atlantic. 12 people died on the ship. That's a lot for one ship, especially if they're sick with fever, because it sounds like that thing was contagious. The surviving settlers landed in Maryland in 1634 and founded St. Mary's City, which was the first capital. Let's see here. Okay, that's it for Maryland. We're moving on to Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the smallest of the 13 colonies, first established by Roger Williams in 1636, having also been banished by the Puritans in Massachusetts. Goodness, the Puritans are just banishing all types of people.
Goodbye, 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 goodbye.
Okay.
Goodbye, goodbye.
Roger Williams wanted to establish a safe haven for religious freedom. So this is how seeds of this is right here. People want religious freedom. There has to be a balancing act. If you're going to establish a Christian country, a country that worships God, that's great, but you can't make everybody worship with you. God never forces us to worship him. And if people don't want to, as long as they're not trying to demand that other people not worship God, and they're just worshiping in their own way, or whatever they're worshiping, sports or entertainment, you can't just banish them, because then you see what's happening now? Now he's establishing a different colony for religious freedom. The Puritans are there for their religious freedom. Now they banish the people that don't agree with them. And
how do they just banish them?
They say you can't live in our town anymore. You got to get out of here. And then now this guy is establishing more religious freedom. Cruz, get your mask, please, and put it up top. So here now, I don't know how this will go, but it's kind of like a pattern, or a cycle of establishing religious freedom, a colony for religious freedom. But then if you don't agree with my type of religious freedom, you're out of here, man.
Yeah, so now they're establishing A colony of religious freedom and a colony of religious freedom.
So this is where we started off wrong from the beginning, our country. A lot of people say that we were formed as a Christian nation. No, we were formed on some Christian principles, but that's different than being a Christian nation, because true Christianity means that God is the king, and God isn't the king here. The people are saying, well, if you don't worship God like us, you can't be in our village. That's not what the Lord says. And you can't make people worship God. All right. And just being founded on Christian principles is very different than being founded on the actual person of Christ, on Christ actually being the king. Okay, moving on. Let's see. So he named the town of Providence, Rhode Island, to reflect his belief in God's providence for leading him to the new colony. Rhode Island quickly attracted more settlers. Case in point. Do you remember John Wheelwright, who was banned from Boston for defending his sister-in-law's religious views? Well, that sister-in-law was Anne Hutchinson, a Puritan of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and was a midwife and the mother of 15 children. The controversy surrounding Anne started when she challenged the clergy of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to preach a covenant of grace in the Puritan churches, which she perceived to be legalistic and works-oriented. So she's saying, what you're preaching is saying that you have to do this and this and this for salvation. And that's not what Jesus says. Jesus says, believe, and he'll change you the way he needs you to be changed. Anne Hutchinson, she was placed on trial in 1638 and exiled for her critical views. See, this is where I'm thankful for our church, because you can disagree without being
exiled
from the church.
It's like we're advertising for NCC.
NCC, people. No. It led her to make a new life in Rhode Island, where she, her family, and loyal church members further established the colony that Roger Williams started for religious freedom. Okay, so I also want to point out here, it says that he believed that God was leading him to a new colony. Well, the Puritans also thought that God was leading them to establish their colony, and it's likely so. I think a lot of people believe that if these two extremes, like the Puritans couldn't possibly have been led by God if they were also being hateful. That's not true. Because God works through weak people. He can move you, and you still have weaknesses or wrong viewpoints that you haven't corrected yet, or that he hasn't convinced you of yet. Let's just take Abraham, for example. And just Hagar. We were just talking about it. Was Abraham being led by God? Yes. However, what did he do to Hagar? He abused Hagar. He made her be his wife, his second wife, and have his child. And that's an abuse. That's wrong thinking. That's saying I can have two wives. They then kicked her out of the house. He also thought that God was calling him to sacrifice Isaac, and God wasn't. He was just trying to say, hey, these views that you have of me are wrong.
I thought he was testing him to see if he would actually obey God over everything.
That is one perception of it, but I like what Oswald Chambers says, and he was saying that what he was doing was I forgot the word, but he was basically clearing Abraham's mind of who he thought God to be, because Abraham came out of a culture where child sacrifice was common. That's what you did for those idols, was sacrifice children. And so he thought that God was calling him to sacrifice his child. And God provided, if God had actually been calling him to do that, then Abraham would have done that. But God was showing him, hey, I have already made the sacrifice, all the sacrifices necessary. That's not who I am. I don't call you to sacrifice children. He was correcting his viewpoint of who God is, because our viewpoint of who God is greatly affected by when we're children, who we see in authority. And when he grew up in this culture where you sacrifice children to the gods, and so he still had that in his mind of,
since God was God, so he was like, well, I'm supposed to sacrifice my child to God.
Now I'm not saying, because he did believe, because he said the boy and I will be back, meaning he believed that the Lord would resurrect Isaac. But I'm saying all this to say that we can have wrong mindsets and God can still be leading us and still be working through us, despite the fact that we don't have it all figured out. Because a lot of people think, okay, if God is leading you, then your viewpoints must be exactly correct. Not true. And I say that to say that's a misstep for us in our country's history, because we start to cancel people and say, oh, well, they were a completely bad person because they had this wrong viewpoint, especially when it comes to things like slavery. Okay, their whole life didn't matter because they had a slave. Yep, they were wrong to have a slave. That doesn't mean they were an incredibly horrible person all the way around. That doesn't mean they weren't a Christian. We're very complex people, and we can have wrong viewpoints in certain areas and still be led by God and still do good things. And that doesn't mean that you need to characterize the entire person as horrible because they've done
one thing.
Yeah, or done a few things.
Not that we're saying that slavery was not bad. Slavery was very bad and evil.
Yes, it was very bad and evil. Just like child sacrifice is even worse than slavery. It's way worse than slavery. And yet, we call Abraham the father of many nations. That's what God called him. We honor Abraham as a follower, the first, the first of the Israelites. We honor him, and yet he thought child sacrifice was right. So I'm saying that to say that we need to look at people the way that God looks at them. Call the good out. See that they were wrong. Yeah, Abraham, that was wrong. Child sacrifice. Oh no, we don't do that, sir. No, we don't make women be wives against their will, sir. No, all that was wrong. But at the same time, we still need to recognize that God is working. Recognize that he was believing God against his culture, because he did have to take a stand. Recognize the good things that he did do, and call those things out. And it's a tension. It's holding both. You've got to be able to hold the tension between this was wrong, but he was doing this right. So I think that's all we have time for. We didn't get very far today. Do you guys have any other comments?
No.
We are going to be talking through a lot of this because I want especially to start looking at the seeds in our country. There are good seeds that were planted and bad seeds. And it's just like in our heart. When seeds of the world are planted, we have to pull those seeds up like weeds. Because
Weeds.
Yeah, because the weeds will choke out the good seeds of the kingdom if we don't pull them out. All right, we are on page 12.
Oh, we made it to page 12. Hallelujah.
And we will move on to page 13 tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.